light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved ever be. Welcome. I'm Sister Who, and I've been Sister Who for 27 years now at the time of this recording, so appeared all over the world and all sorts of different things. And I don't say any of that to pat myself on the back. To me, being Sister Who is all about serving others' personal and spiritual growth. There was a particular time about, let's see, it would be about seven years into the work, that I was going through the breakup of a primary relationship. It was very difficult for me to keep being Sister Who because of trying to reestablish my sense of home, trying to find a way to support myself, all sorts of things. And financially it was difficult. In terms of my concentration it was difficult. But I was doing television shows and a newsletter at the time and helping out with other people's fundraisers and so forth. Any humanitarian work I could. And every time I would wonder, as difficult as it was to keep the work going, is it time for me to stop and just say Sister Who is now retired or whatever? And I can't imagine ever being retired actually, but every time I would think about it, within a couple days, somebody who had no idea I was having doubts would come up to me and express how important the work was, and please don't ever stop. And it was only a couple months ago that I got an email from someone who who'd formerly been in the military, and I'm not sure of his whole life situation, but he too said, thank you for being you, please don't ever stop. And so at the time that I was going through this transition, about 20 years ago actually, every time I thought about quitting, something would come up to say, don't ever quit. And so finally I went to 3 weeks of prayer and asked God, what is so important about continuing this work? And after 3 weeks, the answer I finally got one evening, I pulled out some graph paper and started drawing, and I intuitively wound up drawing this huge spiritual retreat and conference center that had 10 towers and was arranged in kind of a nautilus shell sort of fashion, so that it was infinitely expandable, that you could, as long as you wanted to, you could just add another tower and another tower and another tower. And there were rectangular rooms between the towers, so that from the air it would begin to look like a nautilus shell, getting bigger and bigger as far as you wanted to go. You could stop with the initial 10 towers, or you could go on to much more than that and just keep going. The rooms in between the towers, I decided, would be for other holistic health and spiritual growth kinds of activities. A library, a massage room, a room where practitioners could do Reiki or homeopathy or herbal remedies of various kinds. All sorts of different things that would bring an alternative approach to being holistically complete and healthy individuals. And that this whole center would orient around bringing life, I guess you could say, focusing on the basic fundamental spirituality of humanity, over and above and beyond the scope of any religion, because it wasn't about any particular religion. It wasn't about Christianity or Judaism or anything. I suppose because of myself being an eclectic mystic and drawing from so many different belief systems and spiritual paths, it would make sense to have that sort of correspondence. But the conclusion of the whole work was that the ultimate goal of Sister Who is to create this spiritual retreat center or spiritual center. It's, in a sense, it's retreating from the world, but it's advancing in spiritual growth. But I wanted it to be inclusive, something that would welcome people of any belief system or none. That whether you were an atheist or a Christian or a neo-pagan or whatever, or if you had no idea what you were, if you were an agnostic, and simply affirmed that it could all be out there, but we have no way of knowing anything for certain. Well, at this stage in our growth, we don't, and I don't know if any of us will live long enough to see it, but to me, there's too much there to leave it unexplored, to leave it uninvestigated, and to refrain from asking the questions just because they're difficult questions. I mean, that kind of seems like the coward's way out. But as I was working out the details of this center, and how there would be a 100-foot diameter circle in the center where you could have outdoor rituals, and if it was neo-pagans, we could have a bonfire in the center, and if it was Christians, there would be a piece of flagstone to put over the center, and you could put a pulpit or an altar or a cross or a Christmas tree or anything you wanted on that center point. You could put a giant menorah if you wanted and do a Jewish service. I mean, it would be a space that was adaptable to any and every purpose. And the way around this 100-foot circle would be 7 trees, saplings that would grow up through this open structure. I was kind of reminded or thinking as I was designing this, what kept coming to my mind were the old cathedrals from 1,000 years ago. Well, not so much cathedrals, but the ruins of churches, I believe, especially in the British Isles, where there are some structures that are still standing, but they're not in use. They have no roofs. They are from 1,000 years ago, but they were clearly some kind of worship space. Now they're overgrown with vines, and there's some walls and such, but the roofs are gone. And so I was thinking of this circular outdoor worship space that would have columns around the outside, and then 7 beams that would arch up and meet in the center, kind of like a giant 7-armed star that was over the whole thing, but an open roof, so that these trees would begin to grow up between the beams over time, and that the beams themselves could be covered with grapevines perhaps over time. That it would be a very natural setting and yet a very worshipful setting, and yet something just as welcoming and supportive to neo-pagans, Christians, and atheists as to agnostics or Jews or Muslims or anybody. Simply an available space, and the purpose of this would be to provide sacred space for people of any belief system or none, to provide a way of nurturing the relationship between the human and the divine without dogma or discrimination of any kind. That an atheist who wanted to come and set up a telescope on the night of a new moon and study the stars and contemplate the universe beyond oneself, and that the things, the nebula and stars and astronomical phenomena that were being seen were things that defied explanation, and that probably would have components or dimensions of being or ways of being that are beyond human comprehension, because we're simply not there yet. We're in terms of the universe as a whole, humanity is so much just a child beginning to take its first steps. And by having this positive relationship with cosmic mystery or divine mystery, however you wish to name it, that it would create opportunity and expansion within the human spirit to allow humanity to become more than it has thus far been. That all we know does not have to be all we ever know. That there's ways to grow and ways to become and ways to expand more, so that this would be a space that provided that place. And which to me, it seems like a number of times throughout my life, I have been very much involved in creating sacred space, in making a place for spiritual and sacred things to happen. Even if the sacredness, I think there's a quote attributed to Einstein, and I don't remember exactly how it goes, but it was something about being so in awe of the universe and of what he would see looking through a telescope, that he was filled with awe, and he found himself to be a deeply spiritual man without necessarily embracing any particular dogma or religious tenet. And as I hear neo-pagans describe their experiences of the divine, and Christians describe their experiences of the divine, and Muslims describe their experiences of the divine, and what they all have in common is being filled with awe. And I'm reminded of the movie Contact, by the original story or premise being written by Carl Sagan, in which this atheistic scientist played by Jodie Foster travels in this sphere, presumably to the other side of the universe, and then is returned to the very second that she left, so much so that everyone else thinks nothing happened, but she was gone for 18 hours. And when she gets there, it fills her with so much awe that all she can say is that there are no words to describe this, and I had no idea it was this beautiful. And she is just so filled with awe. And in my humble opinion, that's having an experience of God. What exactly the word God means will be debated, I suspect, till the end of time. As long as there is humanity, we'll still be debating what it means, and why did one person have one experience and another person have a completely different experience, and a third person, as far as they know, had no experience at all. Why does the divine choose to reveal itself in scientific terms and theological terms and spiritual terms and emotional terms and concrete physical terms and historical terms? And it seems almost, even within the Old Testament record of the Bible, it seems like God rarely revealed God's self in the same way to any two different people. It was always something new and different. There were very few phenomena that were repeated over time. Perhaps the only example I can think of for that would be when there was a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night to lead the Israelites from Egypt to the Promised Land. But other than, and then it was kind of an ongoing relationship of sorts. But there was only one burning bush and only one Damascus road and so on. It raises the question, I guess, of with the Hubble telescope, we take that it has brought us these incredible photographs of things so large that we cannot comprehend the dimensions of them, that the whole of our galaxy could fit within one dot of this picture, that in an entire human lifetime you could not travel from one side of the picture to the other in terms of what the Hubble telescope has seen. It is so vast and so awe-inspiring. And yet to come to terms with the reality of that in a way that is empowering and humbling and inspiring all at the same time, and fills us with awe and makes life so much more than it is, so that it's not a question of being content with being small, but it's a question of being in a relationship to that which is so beyond us in ways that are empowering and inspiring. And I mean, I don't mean to keep using those words over and over until I wear them out, but the English language is far too limited to describe even what, if we had been with Jodie Foster in that experience in the movie of Contact, seeing the universe from the perspective that scientist saw it, that there would be no words, and we would, like me probably, keep repeating the same words over and over again till they didn't mean anything, because we want to express what we've seen and our language is not adequate. In trying to come to terms with that in a constructive way, and in trying to come to terms with being Sister Who and finding something that defies explanation, how did these people know that I was thinking of stopping doing the work, and come up to me usually within 24 to 48 hours of me even thinking the doubt and telling no one, somebody somehow would know and come up to me and say, please don't ever stop. I didn't tell them. How would they know? But the synchronicity became so predictable, and it happened so many times. And then I asked why, and having this answer come through of this spiritual retreat center. And in having this come through, and then deciding a number of years after that, that if that's what the work of Sister Who was ultimately, if that's what the aim ultimately was, if that's what this work was building to, that even while I didn't know where it was going, that somehow God knew this is what it was supposed to be. And when I finished drawing the whole floor plan that evening when my prayer was finally answered after 3 weeks, I looked at it and I calculated out from my math classes square footage of this and square footage of that, and I thought, my God, this is over 20,000 square feet. This is a huge, huge center. How could this ever be? And yet, if God can create the universe out of nothing, then there's no question that it can be at whatever point. It's just a question of how do we get there? What are the steps of this journey between here and there? And it was because of all that, years later, that I decided to enroll at Iliff School of Theology and get a master's degree in theological studies, so that when the time comes for actually building this place, and then of course I had to decide, well, what do we call it? What is the name of this? And it was several years afterwards that I decided ultimately the name that makes sense is God Space Sanctuary, because it is a spiritual sanctuary, and it's a space for making space for God in your life, but a God according to your own definition, not at all constrained to the definition that any church or religion would provide, but your own definition. When I was in, one of the things that impressed upon me, I guess, the need for sacred space was a particular experiment that two acquaintances and I tried when I was in college, that we decided for one summer, every Friday night from 7 to 8 o'clock, we would, wherever we were, allowing for different time zones and everything else, but according to Central Time Zone, 7 to 8 p.m. on Friday evening, wherever we were, we would all three pray at the same time. And then after a whole summer of this, we would meet again and discuss what happened, if it had a measurable effect of any kind, if synchronicities started happening or whatever. And as far as I know, I'm the only one who did it. The other two never got in the habit of doing it, but I made a point that entire summer, and if I was working at a part-time job, I explained to the manager of the store, I kind of went out on a limb, and you may think I'm crazy, but this is what we decide as an experiment, and the manager of the department store was willing to support me by saying, yes, you can be gone for this hour every Friday night so that you can do this. Well, it seems ridiculous in retrospect that the manager, my employer, was willing to support this. But of the 10 or 12 churches in my hometown, there was not a single church in town that was willing to unlock their doors and let me in to use their space to spend an hour in prayer every Friday night. They were not willing to support this experiment that I and these two other college students said we wanted to do. So my space for prayer became an abandoned gravel quarry 10 miles south of town. And every Friday night I would jump in the car and race out to the gravel quarry and walk around praying out loud for an hour, and jump back in my car and race back to the store and finish my shift that night. And I did that all summer long. That was, I guess you could say, a spiritual discipline that I did. I don't remember whether there was anything particularly, whether anything I could point to say, yes, it had an effect or whatever. There was one time I found a little odd, but I was never sure what to interpret from it. When I got to the gravel quarry and went to the usual spot, I'd even made a circle of stones in a back corner from some stones that were just sitting there. somebody had come in with a plaster cast of the Mayan calendar. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's all kinds of Mayan symbols in this circular configuration. And they had a plaster cast of that had been broken over one of the stones in that circle. And I wasn't sure what that meant, if somebody figured out what was going on and was trying to deface it, or if they had no idea, or, I mean, it was too peculiar of a synchronicity to have a spiritual religious symbol broken on a place that, to me only, and only me, with no sign or indication or whatever, had some kind of spiritual significance, and to have the two converge. But I don't know what it meant, and I've never been willing to assign a negative interpretation. But somehow it was a convergence that remains a mystery to me. But the point of that exercise being that no church would allow me in. And in my heart, I knew this is wrong. There must always be a place to pray. And, then of course other people would say, well, you can do it in your car, or you could do it. There was one of the reformers, one of the ministers who was known in Europe during the Reformation period, and I read this, but I don't remember who the name was, but his wife, they had a lot of kids, and when she needed a place to pray, she would sit in the corner of the kitchen and throw her apron back up over her head and pray inside her apron, and because that was the only way she could accomplish any sense of privacy for prayer. And it sounds amusing in a way, but hey, if it worked. To me, I guess because of growing up Catholic with stained glass windows and pipe organs and all the pageantry and theater of worship and everything, it seemed like there should be a physical space that is somehow recognized as sacred space. There should be a distinction between the sacred and the mundane. There should be, to use the modern metaphor of Harry Potter, there should be a distinction between Hogwarts and the Muggle world. Some way that you know when you're in magical space and you know when you're in mundane space, in ordinary space. And for my neo-pagan friends, it has to do with casting a circle and then uncasting the circle at the end, so that they essentially create space anywhere. All that's well and good, but somehow there still seemed to be an intuition, a calling in my heart that there needed to be a physical space where someone could come without any intention or agenda and simply sit quietly and wait and listen and somehow be brought to an awareness of their own spirituality, whether it's described in scientific terms or theological terms or metaphorical terms or whatever terms. There needed to be a space. Humanity needed a way of remembering that we have a spiritual component. In my humble opinion, religion is simply society's attempts to systematize and manage the spiritual element within each person, to systematically manage how everyone answers the question of how do I relate to that which is beyond me? How do I relate to divine mystery, to the part that I don't know yet, that I may not live long enough to know, but it is so awe-inspiring that I'm going to reach for it, and I'm going to engage in a regular discipline, even if it's just to step aside and sit for an hour and listen and then get up and go on about my life again. It's a practice that I'm going to engage in order to nurture the spiritual part of myself, that part of my consciousness that is not physical, that for which I have no explanation. That science cannot give enough explanation to say why this person has this personality and this aptitude and these dreams and that memory that they've never experienced. That all these unexplainable but intangible parts of each person, there is something of me that is not physical, that is more than physical. It is spiritual. It is spirit in nature. And it doesn't always stay within the boundaries of some particular dogma or theology or somebody else's description. like Jodie Foster in the movie Contact, she experiences it. She's there, she's present. She has no way of explaining it, but she cannot convince herself that it wasn't real. But it is so beyond where she is as a human being. And because she cannot dismiss it, it compels her to be someone that she would not otherwise be without that experience. That ultimately is what I hope people discover through any spiritual center I am ultimately able to construct. That when we build the towers and the workrooms and the gardens and the labyrinth, the meditation labyrinth, and the structure for the trees and the grapevines, and we look up to a dark night sky filled with stars and say, God, if you're there, make yourself real to me in whatever way you know is best. And if nothing happens, I'm fine with that. And if you manifest, I'm listening. Thank you very much for watching. I hope some of the things that I've mentioned are helpful to you, and I hope we both get blessed someday to see God's Space Sanctuary actually be built to support any and every configuration of spirituality humanity can imagine. Thank you.